The old woman was still crossing the road when the billionaire stepped out of his car. Before anyone could react, he slapped her, kicked her, screamed at her to leave the road. She fell, cried, picked up her firewood, and walked away in silence. He drove off laughing, not knowing that in that moment he had just destroyed his own life. Because from that day on, nothing worked for him again. If you believe pride can ruin a man faster than poverty, subscribe, like, and comment below, and listen carefully. This story will change the way you see people. Now, let me tell you how it all began. His name was Damien Cade, and the moment people heard it, their shoulders tightened. In the cities where money ruled everything, Damien was not just rich, he was feared. They called him ruthless because he showed no mercy in business. They called him arrogant because he never bowed his head to anyone. And they called him untouchable because no matter how many enemies he made, nothing ever seemed to touch him. That man was born lucky, people whispered. Fate is on his side. Damien himself believed this. He often said, with a cold smile, "The world belongs to the strong. The weak are just passing through." When he walked into a room, conversations died. When he spoke, people listened. Not because they loved him, but because they were afraid of what he could take away. His empire stretched wider than most men could imagine. He owned companies that controlled shipping, construction, oil, and technology. His luxury cars filled entire garages, each one more expensive than the last. Private jets waited for him at airports like obedient servants, ready to fly him anywhere at a moment's notice. His mansion stood on hills and coastlines, surrounded by high walls and armed guards. Places so large and quiet they sometimes felt empty. At night, he sat in rooms made of glass and gold, looking down at cities full of people he believed were beneath him. "Look at them," he once said to a business partner, swirling wine in his glass. "All struggling. I refuse to be one of them." The partner laughed nervously, unsure whether to agree or stay silent. Women surrounded him everywhere he went. They smiled too brightly, laughed too loudly at his jokes, and touched his arm as if they belonged there. They admired his cars, his houses, his power. They loved the shine of his money, the doors his name could open, the life he could buy them. But when Damien looked into their eyes, there was no warmth there, only calculation. Still, he did not care. "Love is for poor people," he once said, pulling a woman closer as cameras flashed. "Money is loyal. People are not." And so he lived, admired, envied, surrounded yet completely alone, standing on top of a world he believed he owned, unaware that everything he trusted was already beginning to slip through his fingers. To Damien, poor people were not human beings with stories. They were problems he wished would disappear. In his mind, poverty was a crime. He believed the poor were lazy, because, as he often said, if they worked harder, they would not be on the streets. He believed they were dirty, not just in clothes, but in spirit. He believed they were useless, offering nothing to the world except excuses and noise. Whenever the topic came up in conversation, his voice always hardened. "Do you know why they are poor?" he once asked during a business dinner. "Because they love suffering. They are comfortable with it." Someone tried to disagree gently, saying, "Sir, some people are just unlucky." Damien laughed, a dry and bitter sound. "Luck?" he replied. "Luck favors those who refuse to be weak." He avoided markets where people bargained loudly and sweat mixed with dust. He hated slums with their narrow roads, cracked houses, and the smell of hardship hanging in the air. Any place that carried the scent of struggle made him uncomfortable, angry, restless. If his driver accidentally took a road that passed near a poor neighborhood, Damien would shout from the back seat, "Turn back immediately. I don't want to see this mess." He rolled up his windows tightly, as if poverty itself could crawl inside and stain him. To him, these places were reminders of a life he despised and feared becoming. Beggars affected him the most. The sight of a hand stretched out, trembling, asking for help made his stomach twist. His face would tighten in disgust. Sometimes he felt physically sick, as if the air around them poisoned him. "Don't let them come near me," he would snap at his guards. "They smell of failure." Once, a young beggar approached his car at a traffic light, tapping softly on the glass. Damien exploded. "Get away from me," he shouted. "Find something useful to do with your life." The light turned green, the car moved, and the boy was left behind, confused and small in the dust. Damien leaned back, breathing hard, anger burning in his chest. To him, the poor were a reminder of everything he hated, and he promised himself every day that he would never, ever be one of them. The convoy moved like a line of authority cutting through the road. 3 black SUVs in front, his own long luxury car in the middle, and 2 more behind. Sirens were not on, but everyone knew who owned that road. Drivers slowed down instinctively. Some moved aside quickly. Others panicked and swerved. Inside the car, Damien sat in the back seat, legs crossed, eyes fixed on his phone, scrolling through messages that brought him no joy. His jaw was tight. His fingers tapped against the leather armrest. He was already in a bad mood. The traffic ahead thickened suddenly. Cars clustered together. Movement became slow and uneven. Damien looked up sharply. His face twisted in irritation. "Why are we slowing down?" he asked, his voice low but dangerous. The driver checked the road and replied carefully, "Sir, there is congestion ahead. We will pass it shortly." Damien scoffed. "I don't pay you to crawl," he said. "Clear the road." One of the security men leaned forward slightly and spoke into his radio, but the road did not open fast enough to satisfy Damien. His breathing grew heavier. He hated waiting. Waiting made him feel like everyone else. The car rolled forward, then slowed again. This time, almost to a stop. Damien slammed his palm against the seat. "What nonsense is this?" he snapped. "Did the whole city decide to block my way today?" The driver swallowed and said, "Sir, there is something on the road. Someone is crossing." Damien leaned forward, peering through the tinted glass, his expression already darkening. "Someone?" he repeated with disgust. "Move them. I am not late because of somebody." Outside, horns blared. Engines idled. Time stretched. The car crept slower, slower still, until it finally eased down almost completely. Damien's patience broke in pieces, and something hot and ugly rose in his chest, waiting for a place to explode. She appeared on the road quietly, almost as if the world itself had gently placed her there. An elderly woman, small and frail, her body worn thin by years that had taken more than they ever gave back. Her back was bent forward, not from choice, but from time, from carrying life on her shoulders for too long. Every line on her face told a story of endurance. Her hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from weakness. Yet, even in her weakness, there was dignity in the way she stood. Balanced carefully on her head was a heavy bundle of firewood. Thick, dry sticks were tied together with old rope, pressing down on her skull, forcing her neck to bow even lower. Each step she took required effort. Each movement demanded patience. She did not rush. She could not rush. The road was wide, the ground hard beneath her bare feet, and the weight above her made her sway gently from side to side. She paused once, just for a breath, adjusting the firewood with trembling fingers. "Easy, easy," she whispered to herself, her voice barely louder than the wind. She looked to the left, then to the right. Cars waited, Engines hummed. People watched from behind windshields, their faces distant, protected by glass. The woman lifted her foot and stepped forward. Slowly. Carefully. One step. Then another. Her knees complained. Her ankles shook. The firewood shifted slightly, and she froze, afraid it might fall. She tightened her grip and continued. Her breathing was shallow now, uneven. Still, she moved on. A driver somewhere shouted, "Mama, hurry up." Another voice added, impatient and sharp, "You are blocking the road." The woman did not answer. She only lowered her head further and kept walking. The distance felt longer than it truly was. Each step stretched time. Her shadow dragged behind her like it was tired too. Sweat rolled down her temples. Her lips trembled, not from cold, but from effort. Halfway across, she stumbled, just a little, then steadied herself. "God help me," she murmured softly, her eyes glistening. She was not asking for sympathy. She was not asking for attention. She only wanted to cross. Slowly, struggling, carrying not just firewood, but the weight of age, poverty, and a life that had never been gentle. And as she moved inch by inch across the road, unaware of what waited behind her, the silence around her grew heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. The moment Damien saw her clearly, something inside him snapped. His face twisted, not with surprise, but with pure rage. His breathing changed. Fast, sharp, angry. "This is it," he muttered, his voice shaking with fury. "This rubbish again." He slammed his phone onto the seat and leaned forward. "Stop the car," he barked. The driver hesitated. "Sir, she is almost across." Damien turned slowly, his eyes burning. "I said stop the car." The brakes pressed. The engine sighed. Before anyone could say another word, the door flew open. Damien stepped out like a storm breaking loose. His shoes hit the ground hard. He didn't walk. He charged. "Are you mad?" he shouted, his voice cutting through the air. "Are you blind?" The old woman turned slightly, confused, frightened, her eyes wide. "Sir, please," she said weakly, her voice trembling. "I am trying." He didn't let her finish. "Trying what?" he screamed. "Trying to waste my time?" People inside nearby cars froze. Windows stayed rolled up. No one moved. Damien raised his hand and slapped her. The sound was loud, sharp, cruel. The firewood shifted violently. The woman cried out and staggered. "Get out of the way," he yelled. She lost her balance and fell to the ground, the firewood scattering across the road. Gasps came from a few mouths, but no one stepped forward. Damien stepped closer, towering over her. "Useless old woman," he spat. "Is this how you want to die? On the road?" She tried to crawl, her hands shaking, her eyes filled with tears. "Please," she whispered. "Please." His foot moved before his mind cooled. He kicked her, not once, but hard enough to make her cry out again. "Leave the road," he shouted. "Disappear." His voice echoed, heavy and unforgiving. A security man shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Drivers looked away. Fear locked everyone in place. The woman struggled, sobbing now, pain written all over her face. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up. Damien pointed furiously. "Now," he ordered. "Move." She gathered herself, picked up the firewood with shaking hands, balanced it again on her head, and began to walk. No one stopped him. No one spoke. The road was silent except for her quiet crying and the sound of Damien's heavy breathing. He watched her stagger away, then turned back toward his car with a sharp laugh. "Idiots," he muttered. He slammed the door shut behind him. The engine started. The convoy moved again. And behind them on that road, fear lingered, thick and helpless, while the old woman crossed in tears, and a line was crossed that could never be undone. The moment Damien's hand struck her, the world seemed to freeze. The old woman stumbled, her balance lost under the sudden force. She fell to the hard, dusty ground, the firewood tumbling beside her with a heavy thud. A cloud of dust rose around her, and for a moment, everything, the shouting, the engines, the impatient horns, faded into a dull background hum. Her body ached from the fall. Her knees scraped against the rough road. Her palms stung. Her heart pounded not just from the physical pain, but from the shock of the violence she had never expected. She stayed down for a brief moment, trembling, closing her eyes, letting the tears form before they fell. She did not scream. She did not cry out for help. She only breathed in shallow gasps, the weight of the firewood heavy, even on the ground beside her. "Oh Lord," she whispered softly, her voice cracked with age and exhaustion. "Give me strength." No one came forward. The cars had stopped at a safe distance. People peeked from behind windows and windshields, their faces pale, mouths tight with fear. Slowly, painfully, she moved. She placed one hand on the scattered sticks, gathered them with shaking fingers, and lifted them onto her head once more. Her back bent further under the burden, but she did not complain. She did not speak. She only breathed, slow and steady now, as though the act of lifting the firewood itself was prayer. She forced herself to her feet, one hand on the road to steady herself, the other adjusting the bundle on her head. Her legs wobbled like young branches in a storm. She pressed on. Tears streamed silently down her face. She cried quietly, not out of weakness, but out of pain and sorrow. Her lips quivered, her eyes burned, but still she moved forward. Her eyes, though, never left him. They were fixed, deep, unflinching, and full of something Damien had never seen before. Something that cut through the armor of arrogance he wore so proudly. It was a look that spoke of years of struggle, of suffering, of endurance, of dignity that no hand, no insult, no kick could erase. She did not speak. She did not utter a word, not a complaint, not a curse. She said nothing. And yet, in that silence, there was a weight heavier than any slap, a truth sharper than any insult. She continued crossing, slowly, painfully, every step a testament to her will, every wobble a demonstration of her strength. The world watched in hushed tension. Damien, standing above her, felt it, though he did not understand it yet. Her eyes followed him, holding him in place, staring not with anger, but with a calm, unyielding sorrow that seemed to pierce through the layers of his pride, into the part of him that had never before felt shame. Step by step, she crossed the road, tears glistening in the sunlight, firewood balanced like a crown of endurance, her gaze locked on him, unflinching, as though silently saying, "You will pay for this, one way or another." And even as the convoy engines roared and the city continued around them, the silence between them became heavier than the world itself. She fell, she struggled, she cried, she crossed, and she looked at him deeply. Damien stepped back from the road, his shoes clicking against the asphalt. He adjusted his cufflinks, brushing dust from his designer suit, as if the whole world and the old woman were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. His chest rose and fell quickly, his eyes still sharp with anger, yet there was a flicker of satisfaction in the way he straightened his posture. "Ridiculous," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head with a short, harsh laugh. "People think they can block my way. Pathetic." The door of his car opened smoothly, waiting for him like it always did. He slid into the leather seat, the soft cushions swallowing him as if apologizing for the roughness of the road outside. His security men fastened the seatbelt with practiced precision, but he barely noticed them. He leaned back, exhaled through his nose, and let out a short, sharp laugh that echoed in the tinted windows. "They'll learn," he said aloud, speaking more to himself than anyone else. "No one disrespects Damien Cade and gets away with it." He waved at the driver, who immediately stepped on the accelerator. The convoy moved again, engines humming in perfect unison, the black cars forming a wall around him. Damien pressed his fingers to the leather armrest, tapping lightly, a small, careless smile on his face. He thought the moment was over. He thought it had been insignificant. He did not see the look in the old woman's eyes. He did not see the quiet strength she carried as she continued across the road. He laughed again, louder this time, as though mocking the world itself. "Fools," he whispered, tilting his head back. "Absolutely fools." And as the city blurred past the tinted glass, as the sun glinted off his cars and reflected in his perfectly polished shoes, Damien had no idea that this single, thoughtless, cruel act, this laugh, this dismissal, this arrogance was not just a fleeting moment. It was the moment that sealed his fate. No one told him yet. No one would. But the universe had already noticed, and the debt had already begun to collect. His laughter would be the last sound of his pride before everything he loved, everything he controlled, began to unravel. And still, he leaned back, content, arrogant, and entirely unaware that his life, as he knew it, was about to change forever. From the moment Damien laughed at the old woman and drove away, life began to whisper its warning. At first, it was small, almost unnoticeable. His cars, which had never let him down, began to betray him. One morning, as he prepared to leave for an important meeting, he slid into his sleek black SUV, running his hand over the polished leather. He pressed the start button, expecting the engine to roar with life, and instead, nothing. Silence, just a soft click. He frowned. "What is this?" he muttered, leaning forward, pressing the button again. The engine groaned faintly, but would not turn over. He banged the steering wheel, frustration boiling. "I don't have time for this nonsense." He called his personal mechanic, a man who had worked for him for over 10 years. "What is wrong with it?" Damien demanded sharply, pacing back and forth in the garage. "Sir," the mechanic said carefully, I don't understand. The engine, the transmission, everything seems damaged. It's not normal. I've never seen anything like it." Damien stared at him, disbelief and anger mixing in his chest. "How can that be? This car is new. Brand new. How is it beyond repair?" The mechanic avoided his gaze. I don't know, sir. It's as if something is causing it to fail." The next day, another car failed. The luxury sedan he relied on for business trips would not start. The air conditioning died, the brakes squealed, and the engine made strange knocking sounds. "This is impossible," Damien said, banging his hand on the dashboard. His assistant tried to reason with him. "Sir, maybe it's just coincidence. Maybe the cars need maintenance. We can call another mechanic." But Damien was shaking now, anger giving way to disbelief. "Coincidence? Do you hear yourself?" he snapped. "These are my cars, nothing fails, nothing." By the end of the week, several of his vehicles were unusable. Mechanics he had trusted for years examined them and shook their heads. "Sir," one said slowly, "they're all beyond repair. Something is seriously wrong. I've never seen all your cars fail like this at the same time." Damien's laughter, so familiar to everyone around him, had vanished. His hands trembled slightly, as he ran them over the steering wheel of a car that would never run again. And it didn't stop with cars. Small accidents began to happen, trivial at first, but unnerving. A minor fire in the kitchen of his mansion. An expensive vase shattering for no reason. Paperwork disappearing from his office. Doors jamming at the wrong times. Phones failing. Emails not sending. Every failure was strange, unexplainable, and growing in frequency. He confronted his assistants, his lawyers, even his friends. "What is happening?" he shouted. "Why is everything going wrong at once?" They exchanged nervous glances. No one had an answer. Maybe it's a curse? One whispered quietly, but Damien laughed bitterly at the suggestion. A curse? Don't be ridiculous. I am Damien Cade. No one curses Damien Cade. And yet, despite his arrogance, the pattern continued. Car after car broke down. Accidents, failures, things that should not have failed. Engines would not start. Computers would crash. Meetings were missed. Projects delayed. Money slipped away in ways he could not understand. Every day brought a new disaster, small or large. Each one inexplicable. Each one relentless. The city whispered. The mechanics whispered. The assistants whispered. Everyone knew something was wrong, though no one dared say it aloud. Damien, for the first time in his life, felt powerless. And somewhere, deep inside, though he refused to admit it, he remembered the old woman on the road. He did not understand it yet, but her silent eyes, her quiet strength, were already at work. The universe had begun its reckoning, and the man who had laughed so easily was about to learn that no amount of money or power could shield him from what was coming. The boardroom had always been Damien's kingdom. The long, polished table, the high-backed chairs, the panoramic windows that looked down on the city he thought he owned. It had always been his stage. He had walked in there a king, and the world had bowed. Every nod, every handshake, every proposal was his to command. But now it was different. Now, when he entered the building, the air felt heavier. Eyes that had once admired him, feared him, or simply obeyed him, now looked at him with caution, with calculation, and, most dangerously, with impatience. It started with small things. A report that was delivered late. A project that was postponed. A voice raised against him in a board meeting. Damien frowned, irritated. "Who approved this?" he demanded, slamming a folder on the table. Silence. The usual obsequious murmurs that had followed his words had disappeared. One of the board members, Mr. Ibe, spoke carefully. "Sir, perhaps we should reconsider the timeline. The market is shifting. Your input may not reflect current realities." Damien's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" he said, voice low, dangerous. "I built this company. I made these decisions. The market bends to my plans, not the other way around." But they did not flinch. They did not tremble. They whispered among themselves, glanced at each other. Something was changing. Something had shifted. The fear that had once protected him was gone. The next meeting was worse. Damien arrived, confident as ever, expecting nods, expecting approval. Instead, he found the room buzzing before he even spoke. Phones hidden under the table. Papers shuffled. Eyes avoiding his. The chairman, a man he had once called a friend, cleared his throat. "Damien, we have decided to vote on a new structure," he said carefully. "We believe it is in the company's best interest to redistribute some of the shares." "What are you talking about?" Damien asked, disbelief cracking his voice. "I am the majority shareholder. I am the one who owns this company." "Yes," the chairman said, voice steady, "that times have changed. We need a new approach. We need leadership that aligns with the board's vision. Your recent actions have caused concern. Concern? Damien felt his stomach drop. His hands clenched into fists. You dare! He shouted. You would betray me? After everything I built? Everything I sacrificed? The vote went ahead, carried quietly, almost silently, without his agreement, without his consent. He lost the majority of his shares. He tried to argue. He tried to plead. He tried to remind them of his vision, his investments, his years of building the empire from scratch. They shook their heads. They spoke in calm, measured tones. It is for the good of the company, they said. We have made our decision. Meetings began to be held without him. Emails he used to send went unanswered. Calls he made were ignored. Proposals he submitted were rejected before he could speak. He walked into rooms only to find discussions about the future of his companies, proceeding as if he were invisible. He tried to enter one board meeting and was told, coldly, "This session is private, Damien. We will update you later." Slowly, imperceptibly at first, he was pushed out. His office, once filled with authority, became a hollow space. The secretary who had once jumped at his commands now avoided eye contact. His assistants whispered outside his door. Rumors circulated in hushed tones. He was no longer the untouchable king he had thought himself to be. He could feel it, deep in his chest, like an ice spreading through his veins. Each slight, each exclusion, each cold dismissal was a tiny fracture in the life he had believed invincible. And no one, not even him, could stop the cracks from spreading. Damien Cade, the man who had once laughed at the poor, the man who had walked over anyone who stood in his way, was learning something he had never considered. That power could vanish faster than wealth, and that arrogance could blind even the strongest. The empire he had built, the cars, the mansions, the endless money, it was slipping away. And the board, once loyal, once obedient, now held the nails of his coffin. Each day they met without him. Each day they signed agreements without his knowledge. Each day they made decisions in his absence. The walls of his authority crumbled further. And Damien, for the first time in his life, was powerless to stop it. The mansion had always been his fortress. Its towering walls, gleaming marble floors, and rooms filled with priceless art and expensive furniture had once been a symbol of his power, his wealth, and his untouchable status. Damien had walked those halls with his head held high, imagining the envy of anyone who looked up at the gates, imagining the awe of every visitor who entered. Every detail from the gold-plated fixtures to the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked over the city had been a testament to his success. He had believed it would last forever, but it did not. One morning, the doors were locked from the inside. A note slid under the front gate read, "Property seized. Effective immediately." Damien stared at it, disbelief freezing his movements. He called his lawyer, then his assistant, then the board, but no one answered. Slowly, the realization began to sink in. The mansion, the one place that had always felt like his kingdom, was no longer his. Every room, every hallway, every memory contained within those walls was about to be taken from him. Security arrived quietly, their faces expressionless, but firm. "Sir," one said politely, almost ceremoniously, "you need to come with us. The property is now under new management." Damien laughed, short and sharp, a sound that lacked its usual confidence. "New management? This is my home," he shouted, voice echoing through the marble corridors. "I built this. I own this. You can't do this." The security men did not argue. They moved with calm authority. "Sir, we have our orders. Please gather your personal belongings. You have 10 minutes to leave." Damien's hand shook as he walked through the halls one last time. His eyes lingered on the grand staircase. the chandelier that had once reflected his celebrations, the walls lined with photographs of a life built on money, influence, and arrogance. Every step he took echoed with the emptiness of loss. He reached the room where he had kept his essentials, a closet filled with designer suits, a drawer with watches that cost more than most people earned in a year, but he could only take what would fit in a small bag. He packed hastily, cramming shirts, a few personal items, things that reminded him of himself, but none of it could carry the weight of what he was losing. The bag was small, paltry, a stark contrast to the mansion he had once ruled. He slung it over his shoulder, feeling the burden not just of the weight inside, but of the life that had collapsed around him. The security men waited politely by the door. "Sir," one said again, "please proceed." Damien stepped outside. The city looked the same, indifferent as ever. The gates closed behind him with a finality that struck him like a hammer. The mansion, with all its luxury, all its power, and all its symbols of dominance, was gone. He was left only with the small bag on his shoulder, and the bitter, growing realization that everything he had believed untouchable, everything he had built his life upon, was gone. For the first time, Damien Cade walked into the world without the armor of wealth, without the protection of power, and without the illusion of love or loyalty. He was alone, stripped bare, carrying nothing but a small bag, and the weight of his own mistakes. After the empire began to slip through his fingers, Damien thought he could at least hold on to his personal life. The people who had always surrounded him, the women who had made him feel untouchable. But even that illusion began to crumble, slowly, painfully, like sand slipping through clenched fists. It began with the calls. His phone, which had once never stopped ringing, now sat silent on the desk. He picked it up nervously, expecting another voice, another plan, another invitation. Nothing. A vibration here. A missed call there. He dialed one of his closest girlfriends, the one who had always smiled so brightly when he walked into a room. "Hello?" he asked, voice tight with hope. Silence. Then the line clicked. No message. No explanation. He tried another. "Damien," she said finally, a strange distance in her voice. I think we need a break." Click. The sound of disconnection echoed in the quiet apartment, louder than any argument could. He called the others. One by one, the voices he had taken for granted disappeared. Each hello became shorter, colder, more distant, until the last one ended with silence and a final click that made the apartment feel unbearably large, unbearably empty. He held the phone, staring at it, as though it might suddenly spring back to life, as though one of them might call and laugh at this absurd joke. But they never did. Friends too began to vanish. Those who had been at his parties, who had toasted to his victories, who had laughed at his expensive jokes, now walked on the other side of the street when they saw him coming. Invitations stopped arriving. Social media posts ignored his tags. Even casual greetings were avoided, replaced by stiff nods or hurried waves as they turned away. He went to restaurants, to clubs, to the cafes he had once filled with laughter, and felt invisible. People whispered behind him. People looked at him and saw not Damien Cade, the untouchable billionaire, but Damien Cade, the man who had nothing left to offer. One night, sitting alone in a dark penthouse he had yet to lose, he realized the truth. He had been loved not for who he was, but for what he had. Money, power, appearances. That was all. Every smile, every flirtation, every "I love you" had been a transaction. And now, without money, without power, without influence, there was nothing left to hold them to him. He remembered the faces, the voices, the laughter that had seemed so genuine. And the weight of betrayal, or perhaps the weight of reality, pressed down on him harder than any loss of property or business. Was I ever really loved? He whispered to himself, voice shaking. He leaned back in the leather chair, staring at the ceiling, at the glittering city lights below, and for the first time felt the cold, sharp edge of loneliness. He had built a life where love was a commodity, where loyalty was measured in contracts and bank statements. And now, stripped of everything else, he could see it clearly. The women who had held his hand, the friends who had laughed at his jokes, the people who had seemed to care. None of it was real. All of it had been for what he could give, not for who he was. The realization burned him from the inside out. Pain, humiliation, and a kind of deep, hollow sorrow filled him. He picked up his phone again, scrolling through numbers he knew by heart, faces he had memorized, only to find silence staring back. No messages, no missed calls, no notifications. Just emptiness. He had thought himself untouchable, but now he understood. He had been untouchable only because of the illusion of wealth. Remove the money, remove the power, and suddenly, he was nothing. And as he sat there in that quiet, dark apartment, the truth hit him like a blow. All the love he had ever known had been bought. All the friendships he had ever trusted had been conditional. And all the women who had adored him were gone, because he no longer paid for their attention. For the first time in his life, Damien Cade felt small, powerless, and utterly alone. The world he had built to keep him untouchable had abandoned him, and the man who had laughed at others' struggles was now facing his own. After losing his mansion, his cars, and his wealth, Damien thought perhaps he could rebuild himself from scratch. Perhaps he could start over, using the only thing he had left: his mind, his skills, his name. But the world he had ruled with fear and arrogance did not forgive easily. He walked into offices that once clamored for his presence, places where his calls had been answered immediately, where assistants had dropped everything just to attend to him. Now, he stood in long lines, clutching neatly folded resumes, his expensive suit replaced by a modest one he had bought with the last of his money. The receptionist looked at him, raised an eyebrow, and said politely but firmly, "Next." He smiled tightly, trying to hide the unease, and handed over his papers. The interview began. Damien spoke confidently, outlining his experience, his knowledge of business, his management skills. But when the interviewer looked closer, recognition flickered in their eyes. A whisper to a colleague, a shake of the head. "I'm sorry, sir," they said finally. We cannot hire you." "Why?" Damien asked, disbelief cracking his voice. "Because of your history," the interviewer replied. "Your reputation. We can't risk it." Damien's heart sank. He had once commanded people with just a name. Now, that name was a burden. He tried elsewhere. Each time he walked into a new place, each time he extended his hand with polite confidence, recognition struck again. Faces went pale. Murmurs exchanged behind closed doors. "Not him," people said quietly. He's the billionaire." And Damien realized with bitter clarity that being famous, being wealthy, being feared, these had once opened every door for him. Now they closed every one. Days stretched into nights. He found a small, cheap apartment, the kind he had once laughed at, the kind he had mocked with sneering words. He had no money for meals, so he ate only what he could afford. Dry bread, water, sometimes nothing at all. Hunger gnawed at him like a living thing, sharp and unrelenting. He lay on a thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, stomach empty, body aching, and for the first time in his life, he felt what he had always mocked. The helplessness of poverty, the shame of dependence, the cold sting of hunger. He remembered the people he had scorned, the hands he had turned away, the faces he had laughed at from his car window, and now he knew exactly what it felt like. The world that had once bowed to his power, that had smiled at his wealth, that had trembled at his name, now looked through him as if he were invisible. No doors opened. No calls returned. No friends came to check. And every night, as he curled under his thin blanket, stomach empty, heart heavy, he understood something he had never understood before. Fear and money are temporary shields. The poor live in endurance. The wealthy who mock them can fall. And when they do, there is nothing to soften the fall but humility and perhaps mercy. Damien Cade, the man who had once laughed at beggars and sneered at those who struggled, now knew the bitter taste of the life he had mocked. He slept hungry. He walked the streets unnoticed. He knocked on doors that would never open. And slowly, painfully, he began to understand that the world had flipped, and he was the one who had fallen. Damien walked slowly, unsteady, through streets he had once passed in sleek cars without a second thought. The sidewalks were cracked, uneven, lined with vendors, and the air smelled of smoke, sweat, and dust. He kept his eyes down at first, but eventually he dared to look. There were people sitting on the ground, holding out hands, begging quietly, eyes hollow, faces weary. And for the first time in his life, he felt a sharp, twisting recognition. That could have been him. That could be him now. He stopped at the edge of a crowded intersection. The cars roared past, honking, but no one slowed. No one looked at him. No one smiled. He raised a hand, almost automatically, as if expecting someone to notice that the people around him didn't care. Mothers held children close. Workers ignored him. And he realized, painfully, that this was exactly how he had looked at the poor before. He had driven past them, rolled up his windows, sneered at their poverty, laughed at their misfortune. And now he was one of them. He sank to the curb, placing his small bag beside him. His hands shook slightly as he rested them on his knees. The fire of pride that had once burned so brightly was gone, replaced with a cold, heavy weight in his chest. Shame rose like a tide, fierce and unstoppable. People brushed past him without acknowledgement, some kicking litter or the dirt near him, others glancing at him with impatience. No one offered a smile. No one offered help. Not even a glance lingered. "Is this me?" he whispered to himself, voice barely audible over the city noise. "Is this what I was?" He clenched his fists, biting his lip to keep from crying. A woman nearby adjusted her shawl, ignoring him completely. A man pushed past, muttering under his breath, too busy to notice. And Damien felt it fully now, the loneliness, the humiliation, the exposure of being unseen, unheard, unwanted. He looked around and saw them all, men and women, children too, sitting, crouching, stretching out their hands. Their faces were marked with the same exhaustion, the same hunger, the same struggle he had once mocked. And it hit him like a storm. He had spent a lifetime above these people, thinking himself better, thinking his wealth and power gave him superiority. But here he was, finally equal to them, finally sharing their shame, their invisibility, their isolation. Tears came quietly, silently, unannounced. He could feel them burn, but he did not care. He stayed seated on the edge of the curb, feeling the rough pavement beneath his palms, feeling the eyes of strangers pass over him as if he were nothing. And in that moment, Damien Cade, the arrogant billionaire who had once scorned the world, understood the weight of every glance he had ever dismissed, every hand he had ever ignored, every life he had ever sneered at. He was standing where beggars stood, and he would never forget the shame of it. The night fell like a heavy curtain, draping the city in darkness that seemed to press against Damien from all sides. The wind cut through the streets, sharp and bitter, and the chill seeped through his thin jacket, gnawing at his bones. He had no warm apartment, no luxury to retreat into, no fire to chase away the cold. The small bag he carried felt heavier tonight, the weight of emptiness pressing down on him as he shuffled along the deserted street. Every corner seemed darker than the last, every shadow longer, every sound sharper. He stopped under a flickering streetlight, shivering, rubbing his hands together for warmth, and suddenly, without warning, her face came to him. The old woman, frail, bent, carrying her firewood, her small frame trembling, her hands shaking as she tried to keep balance, her lips quivering as she struggled to speak, but said nothing. He remembered the way her tears had glistened in the sun that day, small drops running silently down her cheeks, and how she had carried herself with quiet dignity despite the pain, the shame, the humiliation he had caused. He remembered the silence, not a word of anger, not a curse, not a plea, just eyes deep, searching, unflinching eyes that had looked straight at him, piercing him more sharply than any slap or kick ever could. And now, alone, cold, hungry, stripped of everything, he could see it all clearly. Her silence had been louder than any scream, her tears heavier than any wealth he had owned, her strength sharper than any empire he had built. Damien sank to the cold pavement beneath the streetlight, the night pressing in on him. He wrapped his arms around his knees, staring at nothing, but seeing everything. The memories of his arrogance, his cruelty, his laughter at the poor returned like a flood. He remembered the sharpness of his own hand against her frail body, the cruelty in his voice, the thoughtless violence that had seemed meaningless at the time. And now, for the first time, it meant everything. He whispered to the night, voice breaking, I was wrong. I didn't see. I didn't understand. The wind carried his words away, indifferent, but inside, the weight of guilt pressed heavily. Heavier than hunger, heavier than cold, heavier than the streets he now walked like a shadow of himself. For the first time, Damien understood that this was not just punishment. This was a lesson. The old woman, her tears, her silence, her quiet endurance had not left him. She had never truly left him. And now, as the night wrapped around him, cold and broken, he knew that he had to find her, to make things right, to kneel, to apologize, to seek the one thing he had never learned to value, humility. And so he stayed there for a long time, shivering in the darkness, thinking of her, haunted by her gaze, humbled by her silence, and realizing, painfully, that she held the key to his redemption. Damien rose the next morning, cold and stiff, his bones aching from the chill of the night. The city around him moved on, indifferent as ever. But he had one thought consuming him, burning brighter than hunger or fear: the old woman. He remembered her eyes, her silence, her tears. He remembered how dignity and strength had shone through her frailty, how a simple glance had humbled him more than any disaster, any lost fortune, any insult. Determined, he walked to the road where he had seen her last. The asphalt shimmered with heat from the day, dust swirling around his worn shoes. He approached vendors, street sweepers, people sitting on the edges of the pavement, and asked carefully, humbly, "Have you seen her?" An old woman, bent with age, carrying firewood. They looked at him strangely. A few shook their heads. A few frowned, confused by the strange man who seemed lost, out of place. "I don't know," one said, shaking his head. "No one like that round here." Another shrugged. "Haven't seen her." Even the children playing near the curb glanced up and went back to their games, too busy with their own lives to notice him. Days passed. Damien searched every corner of the city, every market, every side street, every dusty lane. He asked shopkeepers, bus drivers, anyone who would listen. But there was no trace of her. It was as if she had vanished into the wind. No one knew where she went. No one had seen her. Nothing. Just silence, emptiness, and a growing ache in his chest that was heavier than hunger, heavier than the cold, heavier than the loss of everything else he had known. Finally, defeated, Damien sank to the roadside where she had first appeared in his life. The sun was harsh on his back, but he hardly noticed. The cars roared past. People hurried by, indifferent. He could feel the dust on his hands, the rough pavement beneath him, the weight of his failures pressing down. And in that moment, he let himself feel everything he had denied for so long. Tears streamed freely down his face. He did not wipe them away. He did not try to hide them. He cried openly, his body shaking, his voice breaking, his sobs loud enough to fill the empty street. He admitted it, aloud, to no one but the air around him. I was cruel. I was arrogant. I was blind. I hurt you. I hurt so many. I was wrong. The words felt strange on his tongue, bitter but cleansing. He repeated them over and over, admitting his sins, acknowledging the lives he had trampled, the hearts he had crushed, the pride that had destroyed him. And in that raw, unguarded state, sitting on the curb, stomach empty, body aching, and soul bare, Damien Cade felt something he had never felt before. Remorse. True remorse. Not the kind that came with fear or punishment. Not the kind that came with losing money or power. This was deeper. It was sharp, it was honest, it was suffocating and freeing all at once. For the first time in his life, he understood the weight of his actions, the pain he had caused, and the strength of the woman who had looked at him and said nothing, but whose silence had spoken louder than all his wealth. And so he stayed there, on the roadside, crying and shaking and admitting, finally, that he was not untouchable, not invincible, not above anyone. For the first time, Damien Cade truly understood humility. Damien sat there on the roadside, body trembling, tears streaking down his cheeks, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a stone. The world felt empty, indifferent, and endless. But then, as he stared at the dusty road, something shifted in the distance. A figure appeared, small and bent, moving slowly toward him. At first, he thought it was a trick of his mind, a shadow dancing in the sunlight, or a memory made real by his desperation. But as the figure drew closer, his breath caught in his throat. It was her, the old woman. Her frame was frail, bent with age just as he remembered. She carried her bundle of firewood on her head, carefully balanced despite its weight. Each step was deliberate, slow, measured, as though the world itself could not rush her. Her hands rested lightly on the bundle, adjusting it with care, her movements smooth and practiced. The road was the same road where he had humiliated her all those days ago. Dust swirled around her worn sandals. The sunlight caught her hair, silver and soft, glinting like the past he had tried to forget. Her eyes lifted, meeting his, calm yet piercing, filled with the quiet strength and forgiveness he had never earned, but now desperately sought. Time seemed to stretch. The cars rushed past, the city moved on, but all Damien could see was her. The same woman, carrying the same firewood, walking the same slow steps down the same road. He wanted to run to her, to kneel, to beg for forgiveness, but his legs felt heavy, rooted in shame. His heart pounded, a mixture of fear and hope. And in that moment, everything he had lost, everything he had suffered, everything he had admitted, all led to this one moment. She was here. She had returned. And he knew, instinctively, that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. Without thinking, Damien rose from the roadside. His legs felt weak at first, trembling from hunger and shame. But something stronger than fear, something deep and urgent, pushed him forward. He ran toward her, his shoes kicking up small clouds of dust, his arms reaching instinctively for the bundle on her head. "Please, let me help you," he said, voice breaking, eyes wide with desperation and awe. The old woman paused, tilting her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, nothing moved but the wind and the dust. Then, slowly, she nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on her lips. Damien lifted the heavy firewood carefully, feeling its weight settle in his arms. It was heavier than he expected, but he welcomed it, welcomed the burden. It was a weight that mattered, a responsibility he had never known before. He adjusted the bundle carefully, making sure it was balanced, making sure it would not slip. He fell into step beside her, walking gently, slowly, matching her pace. Every step felt like a penance, every footfall a quiet apology. The firewood between them was a bridge, connecting the arrogance of the past with the humility of the present. "Thank you," he whispered, almost afraid to speak louder, afraid it might break the moment. The old woman said nothing. She simply walked, each step steady, her presence serene and unwavering. Damien realized that words were not necessary. His actions, his willingness to help, to bear the burden, to walk beside her, were the first true expressions of remorse he had ever given. And in that simple act, carrying firewood together down the same dusty road, Damien felt something stirring in his chest. Something he had never felt in all his wealth, all his power, all his arrogance. Change. He was no longer the man who had laughed at the poor, no longer the man who had crushed those weaker than him. For the first time, he was walking beside someone, sharing their burden, and in doing so, he felt the first spark of redemption. Step by step, firewood balanced carefully, they moved forward together, he humbled, she forgiving, and the road between them stretching like a promise of something new. Damien stumbled as they walked, the firewood balanced between them, and suddenly the weight of everything, the empire he had lost, the wealth he had squandered, the people he had hurt, the pride he had carried for so long crashed down on him. He dropped to his knees on the dusty road, his small bag at his side, his body trembling with exhaustion, hunger and shame. Tears streamed freely down his face, carving paths through the dirt and sweat. He could not hold them back. He cried as he had never cried before, not for money, not for power, not for loss, but for the years of cruelty, arrogance and blindness that had brought him here. "I was wrong," he sobbed, voice cracking and raw. "I was cruel. I laughed at those who suffered. I hurt you. I hurt so many. I was blind. Please, forgive me." His words spilled out, tumbling over themselves, desperate and sincere, carrying the weight of a lifetime of mistakes. The old woman stopped. She lowered the firewood slightly, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, the world felt suspended, the dust and the wind around them fading into silence. Then, slowly, she smiled, a soft, calm smile, full of warmth and understanding. "You have suffered," she said gently, her voice quiet but carrying a weight that made Damien shiver. "And you have learned." He lifted his head slightly, eyes red and swollen, voice still trembling. "Please, I ask for your forgiveness. Truly, from the bottom of my heart. I'm sorry for everything." The old woman knelt down just a little, enough to reach him. She placed her hand on his bowed head, warm and steady, and Damien felt a strange calm begin to flow into him. The touch was gentle, but it carried a weight he could feel deep in his chest, a mixture of mercy, power, and absolution. "Rise, Damien," she said softly, her words deliberate, strong, final. "You are forgiven. Your heart has learned humility. Your hands have carried the burden you once scorned. Let this lesson guide you. Let it shape the man you are yet to become. Damien stayed there for a moment, head bowed beneath her hand, letting her words sink in. They were more than forgiveness. They were a blessing, a release, a final seal on the beginning of his change. He felt something shift inside him, a light where there had only been darkness, a hope where there had only been despair. Slowly he rose to his feet. He touched the hand on his head, trembling. "Thank you," he whispered, voice choked with emotion. I will not forget. I promise I will not forget." The old woman nodded, her smile unwavering. She lifted the firewood again, steady and sure, and continued down the road, leaving Damien standing there transformed, not by wealth, not by power, not by fear, but by mercy, humility, and the quiet, unshakable strength of forgiveness. Damien had barely stepped back from the old woman when his phone rang sharp, sudden and insistent against the quiet of the dusty road. He fumbled with it, heart pounding, hands trembling, unsure if it was another disappointment or a cruel twist of fate. The screen lit up with a number he did not recognize. Hesitating for a breath, he answered. "Hello?" His voice was hoarse, raw from crying, from pleading, from months of hunger, shame and loss. "Is this Damien Cade?" A calm, professional voice asked. "We've been reviewing applications and recommendations. Your experience is impressive. We would like to offer you a position, effective immediately. We'd also like to discuss opportunities to restore some of your previous business ventures. There is potential here for a new beginning." Damien froze, the words sinking in slowly. A job offer. Not just a job, but the chance to rebuild, to rise again, to reclaim some of what he had lost. Not with arrogance, not with cruelty, but with humility and wisdom earned through suffering. His chest tightened, and for a moment he could hardly breathe. I don't know what to say," he whispered, tears brimming again, but this time they carried relief, gratitude and hope instead of shame. He turned instinctively toward the old woman, the one who had changed everything for him with her quiet strength, her forgiveness, her blessing. He wanted to thank her properly, to kneel again, to honor her presence, to tell her what her mercy had done for him. But she was gone. The road stretched ahead, empty now, gusts swirling in the afternoon sun. No footprints remained but his own. No laughter, no eyes, no frail hands carrying firewood. Only the road remained, the same road where she had appeared, where he had fallen, where he had knelt and confessed. Only the road remained, quiet, ordinary, yet somehow sacred, holding the memory of the woman who had given him redemption when he had nothing left. Damien stood there, phone in hand, heart pounding, a mixture of awe and longing filling him. He whispered to the empty road, voice trembling but full of promise. "Thank you for everything." And with that, he turned toward the path ahead, toward a life rebuilt, a future earned, and a man transformed, not by wealth, not by power, but by humility, remorse, and the quiet miracle of forgiveness. Damien ran. He ran as he had never run before, not in anger, not in pride, not in pursuit of wealth, but with a heart overflowing, a chest tight with emotion he could barely contain. His legs moved quickly over the dusty road, the wind whipping past his face, tears streaming freely down his cheeks. He was crying, but not from sorrow this time. This was joy, a raw, unfiltered, soul-deep joy that came from relief, from hope, from the knowledge that he had been given a second chance. Every step carried him closer to home, yet he felt that home was no longer the mansion, no longer the cars, no longer the titles. Home was the person he had become. He was different now, humble where he had been arrogant, compassionate where he had been cruel, aware where he had been blind. Every past mistake weighed on him, but instead of breaking him, it shaped him. He could feel the change in his bones, in his chest, in the rhythm of his heartbeat. Damien Cade, the man who had scorned the poor, who had laughed at suffering, who had believed himself untouchable, would never be the same again. Pride could lift a man high, that he had learned to finally, painfully, eternally, that only humility could keep him there. He slowed for a moment, leaning against a lamppost, catching his breath, looking at the streets where so many had been ignored, where so many had suffered quietly. He whispered, almost to himself, almost as a vow, "Never again. I will not forget. I will treat everyone with dignity. I will respect those who struggle. I will remember that power is temporary." The tears on his face were still there, but they had transformed. They were no longer shame or fear. They were the proof of a heart awakened, of a man reborn. And then he ran again, faster this time, the city stretching around him, the road ahead open, endless, full of possibility. Damien Cade was no longer defined by wealth or fear. He was defined by humility, by compassion, and by the lesson of one quiet, frail woman who had changed his life forever. Pride can lift a man high, he whispered to the wind, voice trembling, but only humility can keep him there. And with that he ran on, a changed man, carrying with him the promise to live differently, to love differently, and to never forget the road, the firewood, and the forgiveness that had saved him. Remember, friends, treat everyone with dignity, respect the poor, and never forget power is temporary, but humility endures.